Okay, so today's lecture is basically about the transformation of class in the decades following the Second World War. Class is something that most people associate with Britain, whether they live in Britain or more particularly if they visit. Most people associate Britain with a certain rigid class system. And class has certainly been thought of as a sort of structuring experience of modern British history. The emergence of a tripartite class system, characterised by the aristocracy, the bourgeoisie or the middle class, and the working class, was seen for a very long time to be the driving force of historical change in Britain. People have used it to explain the Revolution of 1688, the emergence of the Enlightenment culture in the 18th century, industrialisation, democratisation, and so on and so on. Now, this understanding of class has been central to the unfolding of British history, isn't just a product of Marxism, although it's clearly rooted in a Marxist analysis. But historians of all types basically accept the prevalence of class and often use class as a primary explanatory framework for understanding the passage of history in Britain. In the context of this lecture, the working class is seen particularly as playing a central role in any account of the rise and fall of social democracy. The working class is commonly understood to be a product of the forms of industrialisation that unfolded from the late 18th century. It's seen to be a product of the emergence of the organised labour movement in the 19th and early 20th century. And it's also seen to be a product of a particular type of working class culture, of a homogenous working class culture, characterised famously by the historian Eric Hobsbawm as the working class man with a flat cap and a whippet and a pint of beer by his side. Now, social democracy is often seen and explained as the product of the triumph of the working class interest. And the story normally goes that it's a rising standards of living and affluence from the 1950s that erodes some key elements of that working class interest and experience, and indeed ends up producing a new set of politics with a different set of priorities and solidarities that in the end undermine social democracy itself. So today, basically, my task is to have a look at this argument and see how adequate it is, and whether indeed we can understand post-war British history as being characterised by a lessening of class differences, or a reconfiguration of them. So the key question is, does class disappear, or does it change shape? Is class still there in the Britain of the 1970s, 80s, 90s, or does it just look and sound different? Now, of course, you can't simply tell any story of a particular class without thinking about their relationship to the two other classes that are commonly held to exist, namely, in this case, the middle class and the aristocracy. There's a parallel story, of course, about the reshaping of the aristocracy and the middle classes in this years. The aristocracy becomes less associated with landowning and hereditary titles than about a new type of social elite characterised by a particular cultural style as much as by their wealth. And we've already seen in the past lectures that the aristocracy is on display in new types of ways in post-war Britain, at the coronation, at the debutante balls of high society in the 1950s. But the aristocracy also increasingly gets enmeshed with the upper middle classes. There's a blurring of the boundaries between those two groups. And we think of this particularly in terms of the emergence of a new type of cultural elite in Britain. A cultural elite with its homes in the universities of Oxford and Cambridge, in the civil service, and in the BBC. Indeed, a figure Noel Annan, wrote a book called Our Age, in which he talked about a new type of intellectual aristocracy taking shape in Britain in the post-war period. And this convergence was also remarked upon in a very famous book called The Anatomy of Britain, published in 1962 by a South African intellectual, Anthony Sampson. There's also the story of the reformation of the middle classes. And again, we've seen elements of that in the previous lectures, with the growth of the technical and professional salaried workers of the warfare and welfare state, the slow expansion of higher education, the emergence of new forms of middle-class domesticity made possible by the increasing prevalence of consumer durables and the decline of domestic service, and the rise of home ownership. But the focus on this lecture, as I said, is going to be basically on whatever happened to the so-called traditional working class. And I'm going to try and map that today by looking at the ways in which that class was thought of and understood in the work of sociology, politics, and culture. So let me turn first to the social scientific study of class. Now, the first thing I want to say here is that the traditional working class was, of course, always associated not just with men, and that's very important, but with industrial manufacturing and the organisation of industrial workers by trade unions. And the thing that you need to note from the figures you can see behind me is that in these key groups, there's very little change from really the 1930s or the 1950s through to the 1970s. The key part of the of the workforce here, you can see the industrial sector only shrunk by 500,000 between 1951 and 1971. The big drop-off is, of course, in the decades following 1971. Similarly, if you look at the trade unionship, the figures for the membership of trade unions, you can see that, in fact, in 1979, there are more members of trade unions than there ever had been before. Trade union membership actually peaked in 1979 at 12 million. But one key sector of the traditional working class was, of course, unskilled manual workers. And these we do see beginning to decline in the decades after the Second World War. They fall basically from 70% in 1931 to 47% by 1974. Nonetheless, what I'm trying to get across to you in these figures is that measured in terms of the experience of work, there seems to be no disappearance of the working class at all. So how is it that we are going to be engaged in a conversation about the supposed disappearance of the traditional working class? Where did all of this talk of the strange death of the working class come from? Yeah, sure. The figures are very compressed, I'm sorry about that. Okay? So where did all of this talk come from? Well, in important ways, it comes from the work of social scientists and sociologists. Sociology as a discipline actually comes of age in Britain in the post-war period. It's at this point that you see the establishment and the growth of departments of sociology throughout universities in Britain, as you see the growth of the discipline of anthropology in universities in the post-war period. These two disciplines were thought of as key ways of understanding the changing structure of society in the post-war period, and in terms of anthropology, the changing structure of colonial society. And both of these disciplines were very heavily supported and funded by the new welfare state. And one of the things that in terms of domestic sociology that goes on is the attempt to try and study the new locations and forms of working class life. One of the key things that they have to grapple with is, of course, literally the physical relocation of the working class. Between 1945 and 1975, 1.3 million slums were destroyed. And many of those traditional working class neighbourhoods, many of the inhabitants of those neighbourhoods were relocated to new dormitory towns or to new areas within cities. So there's a physical look at change, which is, I think, important. The other key element here was those studies that try to look at the way in which poverty, a key characteristic of working class experience, was disappearing. So C. Baum Rowntree, who you'll remember starts this all off in 1901 with his study of York, has a return study in 1951 called Poverty in the Welfare State that shows that just 3% of the population were now living below the poverty line, whereas in 1901 he had discovered that over 30% of the population were living in poverty. And this was widely seen to be, by people like Rowntree, as a product of the very new welfare services that had been established in the post-war period. Workers, it seemed, were becoming better off. Workers, it seemed, were benefiting from the improved standards of living and the increasingly affluent society that Britain was becoming in the 1950s and the 1960s. And the key question is, what did this do to their understanding of class? So, last week I gave you some sections of Goldthorpe's The Affluent Worker to read, published in 1968. It's a very, very important study, grounded in the investigation of two areas, Luton and Cambridge, and of car workers in those two towns, undertaken in the early 1960s. So although it's not published until 68, much of the research is grounded in the early 1960s. What Goldthorpe and his collaborators find was a new type of working class, a working class that looked really different from its predecessors, because they had basically been what Goldthorpe described as effectively privatized. They'd withdrawn to a new type of private domain of the household, and was no longer associated with the traditional forms of working class sociability. And part of the reason for that withdrawal was that they were trying to maximize their income and their standard of living. The job for them was a key defining feature of social improvement. It wasn't that they were experiencing deprivation in any profound way, but they had basically withdrawn to this new type of suburban lifestyle, withdrawn from the pub and the social halls that had characterized working class sociability and solidarity before. But interesting, Goldthorpe thought that this new type of affluent worker, even though he looked very different from his predecessors, hadn't withdrawn their support from the Labour Party, which of course was seen to be the political party most associated with advancing the interests of the working class. These types of studies were in some ways contradicted by a different set of sociological work. This group of work, which I think is best represented in these two texts you can see at the bottom here, Wilmot and Young's Family and Kinship in East London, and Smith and Townsend's The Poor and the Poorest, try to understand how it is that poverty had to be understood in new ways in the newly affluent Britain. So whereas Rowntree and his followers had always understood poverty in absolute terms, that is to say that there was an income level below which, if you dropped, you couldn't afford the necessaries of life, now these sociologists began to advance a new type of understanding of poverty, one that we still live with today, as basically relative. That is to say that it wasn't necessarily about the lack of necessities. It was now about the lack of commodities that allowed you to fully participate in the new affluent society. So it might be a TV, it might be a telephone, it might be a washing machine. Okay? And the absence of these goods basically made people poor in a new type of way because they were unable to fully participate in the new forms of social life. This is a definition of poverty that is now often termed social exclusion. People are socially excluded from certain forms of participation in social life. These studies basically said that somewhere between 14%, something like 14% of the population were now on low incomes that placed them in this new category of the relatively poor. And that most importantly, those people, a key sector of that group, 2 million of the 7.5 million of them, were children and old age pensioners, seniors, what we call at the US as seniors. New groups, new non-governmental organisations like Help the Aged and Shelter and the Child Poverty Action Group, set up all in the 1960s, I think I mentioned them briefly to you last week, were all established to try and advance the interests of these new groups, and critically to challenge the argument that the welfare state had provided universal care for everybody. They were trying to say that despite the universal claims of the welfare state, these three critical groups, the aged, the homeless, and children, remain disadvantaged within the welfare state. Old age pensioner. Now, it's in the context of this debate that the marvellous documentary series, the so-called Up series, starting with 7 Up in 1964, began. Okay? And I hope you've all watched clips of at least some of it, because we're going to end up talking about it at the end of the lecture. But let me just explain where this fits. The Up series is basically an intervention into this debate about the changing forms of class in Britain. It was put on by World in Action, a documentary series that was the flagship documentary series for independent television, which of course had only recently been established, and which was trying to cement its credentials as putting on serious TV. And the idea of the programme was a very familiar one in terms of social scientists. It was to take a cross-section of the population, a cross-section of 7-year-old children, and determine how far their class position at birth would determine their life outcomes. Now, you'll already be aware that that cross-section that they took now looks a rather strange cross-section in terms of the British population. There's only one person of colour in the documentary series. There's a pretty much a balance between men and women, and there's very few members of the so-called middle classes. Conceivably, there's only 2 or 3 people who fit that category of the middle class. The predominant focus of the documentary in 1964 was of the working classes and of the upper middle classes, the sort of social elite, the people going to private school and imagining their life projected forward to Oxford and Cambridge and so forth and so forth. Now, the key issue that I want to talk about at the end of the lecture is whether this series, which is still running, 56 came out in 2013, just a few months ago, whether this documentary series proves the defining assumptions that it began with, whether the class differences within this group of people seems to have lessened or whether they're still firmly in place. Okay, let's move on to class and the question of politics, or politics and well, that will come on in a moment. I wasn't expecting that. Now, many of these debates about class and classlessness or the reformation of class were animated by very pressing political issues. Effectively, the key issue at debate here is why the Conservative Party had become the de facto party of government during much of the 20th century. Remember that Baldwin and the Conservative Party dominates the period after the advent of democracy in 1918 and 1928, and similarly, in the post-war period, the Conservatives are in power for 13 years, from 1951 through to 1964, a feat that they achieve again after the election of Mrs. Thatcher in 1979, and they hold power all the way through to 1997. Now, for most social scientists, this seemed like a contradiction, that an electorate characterised by a predominance of the working classes should have been voting for their class interests and voting for the Labour Party. But this hadn't happened. So the question was, how come this has happened? Was it about the working class having lost its tribal loyalty to the Labour movement, or was it that the working class was, in fact, just disappearing? So while sociologists focused about the question of the working class disappearing, the political scientists and politicians tried to figure out why it was that the working class voted for the Conservative Party. What animated the working class embrace of conservatism? Was it, they suggested, just old-fashioned class deference, that the working class thought that the aristocracy should be their rulers and therefore deferentially kept on electing them? Was it the embrace of nationalism and racism, and we've already begun to see the way in which the Conservative Party picks up the issue of immigration at the 1960s? Or was it, as I talked about after the Second World War, the desire for new types of consumer goods and the idea that the Conservative Party embraced the aspirations of the working class to enter the world of goods? Now, there's a very famous depiction of the working class conservative in a television series called Till Death Do Us Part, which ran from 1965 to 1975, and which I think you need to understand in the context of these debates. And I'll show you a quick clip of Alf Garnett at work. Oops, well, I will if I can come back and press this.
That's marvellous, ain't it? Hey? Lovely, ain't it? Hey? It's really lovely, that. Isn't it?
I'd say, no, that's nice.
Who is it? They're not relations of yours, are they?
No, Mr. Funny Guts, they ain't. Your information is your 4 generations. A picture of historical rarity.
Yeah? Where'd you get it? Sotheby's?
No, I did not. I got it where I got a picture of him. And him.
In the junk shop.
Yeah, in a junk shop. You're all of England's great men in that. And all of England's great history. Covered in cobwebs. But we will rise again. You worry about it. We will rise like lions and get our empire back. The bloody great British Empire that your bloody Labour rubbish give away to
The people it belong to.
a load of bloody coons and warts. Masons and muckabilly that come over here and scrounge all from us.
Lord, here we go. Packy bashing again.
Look.
Don't start him off. Oh, me?
Look.
You know you don't like him.
I don't like them. I don't like them.
No, you don't.
They don't bloody like each other. There was an I will like them. Come blimey, I was at each other's throats a little while ago. I mean, it's one half of them trying to shoot and starve the other half. So don't talk to me about not liking them.
Look, that was a religious war, that
Oh,
was.
yeah, go on, blame it on God. Blame it on God. It didn't matter. Anything that happens these days, it's his fault, isn't it? Blame it on that man. God, blimey. I bet he's beginning to wish he never made us now.
So you see Alf Garnett, classic traditional working class man in the East End of London, a Cockney, embracing the Conservative Party, the idea of the British Empire, and the racism that came with it. And there's a very uneasy way in which people sort of laugh with or laugh at that racism in the 60s and the 70s. So the issue then was, must Labour lose, which was the title of a pamphlet written by Labour's chief market research public opinion pollster, a man called Mark Abrams, in 1959. And there seemed to be a drift away from the Labour Party. The Daily Herald, which you remember was the one party that was a supporter of the Labour Party, owned by the trade union movement from the 1930s, became The Sun, Britain's most famous tabloid, now in 1959, and embraced the Conservative Party. The Labour Party lost its last newspaper that supported it. So in these conditions, what happens is you try and have a repackaging of the Labour Party, an attempt to try and rethink of its position and its relationship to the electorate and to the working class particularly. So part of that began in the 1950s in the heat of these debates, and it happened with the figures around Hugh Gaitskell, who had become leader of the Labour Party, beating Niall Bevan in the early